Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. We have a fascinating and very timely conversation, which I think is going to drill down quite a bit on what's become a probably overly mythologized topic in Washington conversations about sanctions, Russia, elites, the black box of Kremlin decision-making, the Russian economy, and much more. And we have some truly world-class experts to offer us insights this morning. Before I introduce our speakers, let me just note that this event is now, I think I've lost count, another in our wonderful series with the Daniel Morgan Graduate School. We have had several of those already in the new year, and we have many more on tap, often with a dimension of the national security interests of the United States and the angle in U.S.-Russia relations. But in addition, of course, the Kennan Institute continues its focus on Russian history and culture. And so in that vein, I want to note a couple of upcoming events for those of you who may be interested. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we'll have Masha Lipman, editor of Point and Counterpoint. Not so long ago, my former colleague at Carnegie. She'll be speaking in the fifth floor tomorrow at 11 a.m. About the Kremlin and its ideological toolbox. But then, changing gears, on Wednesday evening at 5:30, please join us for a concert, a centenary celebration of Prokofiev and America, which will feature the Last Stand Quartet of the National Symphony and Simon Morrison, professor of music from Princeton University. And then, last but certainly not least, this week, it's a busy week, at 3:30 on Thursday, our own Deputy Director, Dr. Will Pomerantz, will be launching his book, Law and the Russian State, Russia's Legal Evolution from Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin. And that will be in the fifth floor as well, 3:30 on Thursday. So please join us to celebrate Will's long-awaited masterwork. All right. Without further ado, let me introduce both panelists now in the order in which they'll speak, and then they'll each speak for about 15 minutes or so, and we'll have plenty of time for a conversation. So first, Dr. Nigel Gould-Davies is an associate fellow at Chatham House, also teaches at Mahidol University in Thailand. He's previously taught at Oxford and has been with the British Foreign Office, where his roles included head of the economic department in Moscow and ambassador to Belarus from 2006 to 2009, is that right? 7 to 9. From 2010 to 14, he was head of policy and corporate affairs for BG Group in Central and Southeast Asia, and has written a book, Tectonic Politics, Global Risk in an Age of Transformation, which will come out with Brookings this year. His bachelor's and MPhil are from Oxford, and his PhD in political science is from Harvard. Dr. Daniel Ahn will follow him. He is now a newly minted global fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're very happy about that. And serves now as a senior consulting economist with the Fed, the U.S. Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and also a professorial lecturer at Hopkins SAIS, and a senior advisor at the Rapidan Energy Group. Starting in the summer of 2019, he'll join Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service as an associate professor of practice. But up until very recently, he was the chief economist for the U.S. Department of State, where he advised the secretary and senior principals on a wide range of international economic and security topics relevant to U.S. foreign policy. Before that, he had an impressive run in the private sector as chief economist for commodities at Citigroup, as well as positions with Citadel, Barclays Capital, and Lehman Brothers. He's held research and teaching positions at Harvard, the National Bureau for Economic Research, Columbia, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the IMF. His AB in economics and finance with honors is from Princeton, and his PhD in economics is from Harvard. So, Nigel, the floor is yours.
Matt, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to share some ideas and lines of inquiry about sanctions and their potential impact. And surely no better place to discuss these questions in the Woodrow Wilson Center, not only by virtue of its intellectual pedigree, but by virtue of the fact, too, that Woodrow Wilson was one of the major modern exponents of economic sanctions. I'd like to explore some issues today about sanctions and about specifically their impact on elites in Russia and the potential implications of that impact and the decisions and choices that face elites on Russia's longer-term future. I don't have a particular thesis to propose, but I think it's important to air some questions which only become more important over time. And I'd like to make 3 points. The first point is a general point about the condition of Russia today. It's a commonplace that every aspect of Russia today, Russia's condition, is becoming more difficult. This is the most challenging time that President Putin has faced since he took office. There's growing popular concern as well about the direction of travel of the country. That raises the question, how might this situation evolve? And what might the drivers of change be? When this question is raised, one line of answer looks to the possible responses of the Russian state and of President Putin himself, faced with an increasingly constrained economy, adverse international situation, and growing unpopularity at home. How will he respond? Might he seek, as one line of worry suggests, more assertiveness overseas, an escalation of conflict somewhere? Might there be a short victorious war, even, as some have suggested? Might there be new substance put onto the Belarusian-Russian Union? All of these things are possible answers to the question, what will Putin do? A second line of inquiry looks at popular responses. How will the attitudes and moods at a mass level towards Putin himself and the contemporary Russian regime change and evolve? And what might the consequences of that be in terms of discontent, mobilization, decline of legitimacy, and so on? What interests me about these debates is that much less is said about elites, which we can define roughly as those actors with a disproportionate control over significant resources and who are therefore disproportionately well placed to assert and protect their interests. The lesser attention paid to the thinking, the calculations, the interests and possible responses of elites to this deteriorating situation is all the more surprising because we have seen repeatedly across post-Soviet space since the early 1990s change take place from within rather than from below. Major change always takes place, or it certainly is initiated by elites themselves. The key text on this, as I see it, is Henry Hale's masterly Patronal Politics. It's a really a wonderful, elegant, and comprehensive study that shows repeatedly how apparently strong regimes, led by invincible leaders, can weaken and even crumble and decline very quickly when the networks of elite power around them defect, when those elites come to the conclusion that that leader is no longer well placed to protect their interests. Henry goes on to show how in nearly every case the uncertainty and then the defection that follows is associated either with leadership transition or with elections, even imperfect elections. So just hold that thought and ask whether Russia might conform to this larger pattern we've seen in the region, or whether Russia might be an exception. Are there reasons to think that Russia will not follow this logic of a regime being sustained by elites and elite networks until those elites take the view that something different is needed. One might well wish to argue that Russia is an exception. That would need to be argued, though, rather than assumed. One might go back to deeper traditions of the patrimonial state and the elite as really a service nobility rather than an independent set of actors. But again, that's a discussion that needs to be had. I sometimes come across the assumption, oh no, elites, and in particular economic elites, which I'm going to go on to say a little bit about, are just too weak and too helpless and cowed and intimidated now. I think that decision is reached a little too quickly, and one needs to scrutinize that and follow that story with more care. So we have a larger general question about the role of elites in potential change in Russia, change of the kind we've seen elsewhere in the region repeatedly. That's my first point. My second point is to argue that elites now find themselves in an unprecedentedly uncomfortable and increasingly adverse situation in Russia as a consequence of sanctions. 2018 in particular is a significant sanctions year. I'd argue the most significant since sanctions were imposed in 2014, because for the first time major private owners of wealth have been directly and specifically targeted, both by the American financial sanctions in April, but also more generally by the new critical scrutiny with which oligarchs and their money are now being viewed in Europe, in the places where they've hitherto enjoyed fairly untrammeled access. This is especially post-Salisbury nerve agent attack, raising of standards of critical scrutiny. Why does this matter? Because an important section of Russian elites are disproportionately dependent on access to Western financial, legal, property, and public relations systems. It was a very interesting paradox. As Russia became more assertive and more powerful since the beginning of the last decade, especially the middle of the last decade, and then in due course increasingly adversarial with respect to the West, at the same time, a key part of the Russian elite was becoming more dependent on the West. Why did it do so? Well, let's think back to the journey, the short but tumultuous journey that the so-called oligarchs have taken in Russia. Oligarch, the term we've all heard, imperfect but useful, and we all sort of roughly know what we mean. Those still a relatively small number of very wealthy individuals in Russia, networks among them, whose wealth relies on at least nominally private assets. Now we know that private property and private ownership is always less in Russia than it might be in some other countries, but I think there's still a useful and principled distinction to be made between those, on the one hand, whose wealth derives from at least nominal private title to property and assets, and those, on the other hand, whose wealth and influence derives directly from state position, leadership of state companies, occupation of position in state structures. The so-called oligarchs, powerful, influential, penetrated all major institutions in the mid to late 90s, brought to heel very quickly by Putin, more quickly than anyone, certainly they themselves, expected in Putin's first term, the reassertion of the power vertical of a now, again, strong presidency. One of the key responses to that decline in domestic status by the oligarchs was to deepen very rapidly their engagement with, relationships to, in particular, Western systems, that helped them better protect their assets, in some cases their families, and even themselves. To put it another way, they were able to outsource elements, at least, of the security that they were now losing within Russia itself. To that extent, their ability to access and enjoy Western systems of asset protection, legal protection, and so on, helps to stabilize the domestic political order that Putin was building, helped reconcile them, the oligarchs, to the new and more difficult situation they found themselves in Russia. They became much wealthier, but less secure within Russia, more dependent on access to the West. Now, since last year, they have begun to be deprived of at least some of the enjoyment of and security afforded by those Western systems. So that's a setback they haven't faced before. Secondly, in addition to that, they are now finding conditions at home more difficult. In straitened circumstances, the Russian state is making more demands on the oligarchs than before. We've had, even in the past few months, some interesting moments of open sort of tension and friction. So put these two together, unprecedentedly difficult situation. So if people are asking what is the impact of sanctions, one answer that some people sometimes give is, sanctions are designed to hurt the Russian economy, and look, they're not really doing that. And the answer to that is, well, sanctions are not intended as a sort of blunt instrument. They're not intended to impose pain on the economy as a whole, certainly not in the short term. Nor are they designed to hurt, as it were, a large number of small people. They're not designed to cause pain or suffering. They're not designed to do that. There's a recognition that Russia is a uniquely hard sanctions target. It's the biggest economy, relative to the global economy as a whole, to have been subject to major sanctions since at least the Second World War. So it would be wrong to conclude that sanctions are not effective because they're causing limited harm on the Russian economy as a whole. Nor are they likely to cause the collapse or disintegration of the Russian state. Again, Russia is much too hard a target, much too large, much too resilient to be able to be severely attacked or undermined in the way that much smaller sanctions targets have in the past. So, if we want to think about the mechanisms by which sanctions might potentially have really significant effects, look to their impact on elites. So, finally, my concluding point, let's begin to think about the choices that elites now, especially the oligarchs, now face in responding to this unprecedentedly difficult and uncomfortable position they now find themselves in a sanctions world. I suggest there are at least 4 possible courses of action they might contemplate. The first is to get closer to Putin, to seek the protection of the Russian state. However much they've avoided doing too much of that in the past, they've certainly in the past not heeded Putin's repeated calls to de-offshore and return assets to Russia. Perhaps now they might conclude, well, things are just too difficult abroad. Better to seek some kind of fresh bargain, protective bargain with the Russian state. We've seen very active lobbying by the RSPP, the Russian big business lobby group, for example. We've seen attempts like the ill-fated Rothenberg Law, for example, to extend protection over at least some wealthy figures. That's one possible approach. Not an attractive one, I don't think, because, again, things are not becoming easier, they're becoming more difficult in Russia itself. Second option might be to seek protection services no longer in the West, or less in the West than in the past, and in other jurisdictions in other parts of the world, possibly in parts of Asia. That would be a second best solution, but could be one worth exploring. Note, for example, Rusal is already listed in Hong Kong. There could be other jurisdictions that would be attractive. Less attractive than the West, more accessible than the West, but more attractive than Russia itself. The third option might be simply to avoid choosing, to keep heads down, muddle through, hope the difficulties go away, which I'm sure that they will not. That absence of a choice is not really a choice at all, although some might be tempted just to batten down hatches and avoid choosing between different possible alternatives. The fourth and final and most intriguing potential option, of course, is that at least some of those with access to, let us recall, still very, very significant sources of economic wealth and networks within Russia, may be tempted, may be minded to begin to think about how they can use these resources to bring about some form of change in Russia itself. The question then is how, to use the term, how fungible are these sorts of resources? How fungible is wealth in Russia? How far can it be converted into forms of influence? I think it's clear that oligarchs are more incentivized than they've ever been before to try to protect their assets, their futures, in more assertive ways than they have before. Whether they'll choose to do that, of course, is another matter. Will depend upon calculations about how safe it is to do so. There are at least three reasons to think it might be very difficult for them to do so. One is that oligarchs remain very unpopular in Russia. A portion of the Russian population has never fully reconciled itself to them, in particular to the loans for shares agreements in the mid-1990s. The logic of elite-led change in other parts of the former Soviet Union has typically taken the form of elite defection and then mobilization of elements of the population from above, mobilizing people below to move against a regime. Hard to do that if you're unpopular and you don't have a good brand name, so to speak. That's one reason for skepticism. A second reason might be that they're simply too divided. They found it very hard to concert their efforts in the past in pursuit of common interests. Recall the bankers' war of the late 1990s. When they were strong within Russia, they fought fiercely and aggressively among themselves. In a position of greater weakness now, when they feel more besieged, will it be easier for them to, at least quietly and implicitly, work together or not? Who knows? The third and final reason for skepticism would be to say, well, maybe what happened in the early 2000s, the bringing to heel of the oligarchs, the cowing and intimidating by the state, maybe that really was forever. Maybe that period in the late 90s when they were strong, maybe that was an exceptional moment in Russian history, unlikely to be repeated. Maybe other forces, other actors, the state itself, the so-called silovarks, power ministry people with those sorts of backgrounds who have thereby gained great wealth, maybe these are just more powerful than the oligarchs. It's too dangerous for them to try to assert and protect their interests. So even if they may wish to bring about change, they cannot do so. So those are the 3 points I want to make today. And I'll just conclude by saying we can have a discussion about the prospects for elites or some elites to try to bring about change, even if you are not sympathetic to the proposition that oligarchs are at least thinking about this and may try to act on this to protect their interests. I hope we can all agree that we need to pay closer attention in thinking about Russia's future now to what elites of all kinds are doing and are thinking. And finally, and I'll stop here, let us recall too how much variation Russia has shown in its forms of governance over the past 40 years. Russia appears to be strong, but much more often it's shown itself to be brittle. And if we go back, for example, to the Andropov, early 1980s, to the Gorbachev changes, to the disintegration of system and then state, to the roiling adventures of the 1990s, the sudden reassertion of the vertical, the early 2000s. We have here a story of a country that has shown greater change and more unpredictable variation in its forms of governance than any other state in the world that I can think of over this period. So be prepared for uncertainty and surprises, whether elite-led or not. Thank you.
Daniel.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So first, I just wanted to congratulate the Wilson Center and for ranking #1 again by the UPenn for regional studies. So real congratulations to Director Harmon and Bob Litwack and all the fellows and staff of the Wilson Center. So it is indeed a true pleasure, therefore, to be here and to share my thoughts and have an exciting discussion at the center today. So thank you again. What I thought I would do today was to put a little bit of a empirical data flavor to our discussion. Speaking as a data scientist and economist, I would like to share with you just some tidbits from some ongoing research that I began at the State Department, and I'm continuing with my co-author, Rod Ludema of Georgetown University. What we do in this study is I suppose we try to cut at the question of what is the economic impact of sanctions against Russia from a different angle. Much of the previous literature on the economic impact of sanctions has naturally focused on macroeconomic data, given that the sanctions policies were themselves macroeconomic in nature. They were comprehensive trade embargo style sanctions against the entire economy. But of course, as everyone knows, recently we have seen the real rapid genesis of targeted sanctions that focus against specific individuals, elites, firms, certain types of financial or technology transactions. So I suppose we would argue that it requires a very radically different data approach, a big data approach, so to speak, where we look at specific firms and individuals and try and forensically track the impact. So, and it's particularly timely, this discussion on elites, because as we dove further into the data, we realized that there was a very different statistical pattern emerging among a certain set of well-connected or strategic firms, and I'll define what I mean by that in a moment, versus the more general a set of targets in the case of sanctions against Russia. So I'm not going to plow through all of the slides, but I just wanted to highlight some things. So just to preview a little bit some of our findings, we indeed find that the average targeted entity faces a pretty dramatic and statistically robust decline in many measures of financial health, from operating revenue to the value of its asset holdings to the number of employees to the probability of bankruptcy, etc. But there was a subset of those firms that seemed to be moving in a very different direction. As we dove further in, we realized that the sanctions are not occurring in a vacuum. The Russian government seems to be responding endogenously to these sanctions by providing large amounts of largesse, government largesse, to these lucky firms. They come in a variety of forms, which therefore makes it difficult to consistently track, but we've seen everything from direct capital injections to loan guarantees to the granting of state monopolies. I'll just show you a quick example. This is my favorite anecdotal example. Consider Bank Russia, one of the first entities to be sanctioned in 2014, understood to be the private bank for Vladimir Putin and a number of his close buddies. You can't really see the timestamp there, but on April 14th, 2014, so exactly 1 month after it was sanctioned, the Russian government announces that Bank Russia will be the new bank responsible for managing Russia's wholesale domestic electricity market, which comes with it the equivalent of several $100 million in revenue every year. So in our data, we saw Bank Russia's revenue all of a sudden jump, despite getting sanctioned. So understanding and controlling for this form of state bailouts, the shielding effect, as we are calling it, is very important when understanding the full nuance of the economic impact of sanctions on Russia. So what we did is we had to think of some objective way of determining which firms are more likely to be shielded and which weren't. And so we collected a list of, so we combined 3 separate lists of firms. The first being firms that the government of Russia deems of basically strategic importance for national defense and state security. The second is a list of backbone or systemic firms that are important for GDP and for social stability. And the last but not least, a list of systemically important financial institutions. Many, although not all, of the firms that anecdotally we have heard received state bailouts appear on one or more of these lists. This is just a Venn diagram that shows exactly the amount of overlap between these 3 categories of firms. And so what do we find? We find, skipping all the math here, so we find that, so actually let me just quickly, so first just really quickly the headline result. The headline result is that, as I mentioned before, indeed a firm after facing targeted sanctions on average faces a 3% higher probability of bankruptcy, a 1/4 decline in its operating revenue, a 1/2 decline in the value of its asset holdings, a 1/3 decline in the number of employees. But that's assuming that this is not a strategic or an elite firm. If it is elite, then we find that the impact upon the bankruptcy rates goes entirely away. The impact upon operating revenue is entirely nullified. The impact on asset holdings on employment is still there, but the magnitude is cut in half. So this money has to be coming from somewhere, and we can actually calculate how much the total amount of these bailouts should be by literally adding up all of the hypothetical revenue that they should have lost that was subsequently made up by other agents, and it comes to approximately $13 billion US, and growing. So this it's an imperfect measure of elites, but I think this shielding result has to force policymakers to think more carefully about what exactly the economic impact of these sanctions are. As Nigel mentioned earlier, these sanctions were not meant to have a big macroeconomic effect, but they were meant to have a dramatic effect upon the firms. And they do seem to work as designed, as long as the regime does not go in and then bail them out. Once they are bailed out, then obviously the tactical impact upon the firm or the elite itself may be very different from what is intended. And that raises in my head a broader question as to are targeted sanctions really a quote-unquote successful tool in an extreme sense, and this gets back to another of Nigel's points about the fungibility of resources. In an extreme sense, if hypothetically, suppose you sanction a number of elites and then the Russian government decides to raid its pension fund to bail out all of these elites, from an ex post purely economic performance perspective, the impact might not be different than that of comprehensive sanctions, which are impacting the general populace. At the end of the day, the general populace is the one that suffers. But I would argue that that is too narrow-minded a view. Obviously, the agency as to who is responsible for this set of circumstances is very different. In the one case, the sanctions program almost by design is meant to impact the economy as a whole. In another case, it is meant to impact the elites, but it is the choice of the target regime to shift resources to protect its elite at the expense of the public. And therefore, if I have, I suppose, one policy takeaway, but looking forward to the general discussion and to the Q&A session, is that the effective usage of targeted sanctions requires not just the hard power of the sanctions itself, but a linked soft power policy of making it very clear to the impacted public that it is, again, the agency and the choice of their regime to shift resources toward the elites and not the original target country. It also, I think, raises questions about both the power and the limitations of what sanctions can do. Yes, they do seem to have a very big impact. I'm happy to go deeper into some of the mechanisms we've traced as to why these sanctions are as impactful as they are upon a target. But they do seem to have a very big target. But you can only go so far before the target regime may decide to shift resources to protect it. So it creates this trade-off between and limitations as to what it can achieve tactically versus what it can achieve strategically.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. That was simply brilliant and a wonderful introduction to what I'm sure is going to be a lively conversation, and we have plenty of time. Thanks for shifting around there, Nigel. I want to start by taking advantage of my platform here and asking you each what I think of as kind of the takeaway question, but maybe I'll be too leading and just tee you up for sort of what you've already said. By the way, thank you, Daniel, for doing my job for me and tooting the horn of the Wilson Center. It's pretty awesome to work among colleagues who are such outstanding regional experts. But then an event like this, where we can connect kind of cross-cutting expertise, economics, finance, business impact on our region in particular. This is just a wonderful opportunity. So let me actually start with you, Daniel, and then I'll come back around to you, Nigel. Following on your last point, which I think is really vital, let me underscore this. So this notion of the regime making a positive choice to transfer costs onto the general populace obviously is accompanied in the case of the Russian state, which controls the media that is consumed by most Russians, with a very clear message as to whose fault this is, and that is not them, it is us. So we understand, and I think your policy recommendation took adequate account of the need to communicate with the general Russian public to try to combat some of the undesirable policy effects of this transference strategy, or this bailout. What did you call it? The shielding effect. Fantastic term. But I worry there's another dimension, and I'm going to come back around to this with you as well, Nigel, which is the inside game dimension. I remember actually in the case of Belarus, if you go back to the first imposition of the Belarus Democracy Act sanctions, there was a conversation within Belarus, which has a much, much watered down version of oligarchy, barely any at all actually, but there was a version of the question of sort of, why are you not on the list? So actually, when you began to do kind of targeted imposition of sanctions against individuals and you made lists of individuals, in this case it wasn't about assets, it was more about visas and access and things like that, it gave rise to a whole other potentially undesirable policy outcome, which was regime consolidation. It created an instrument internally whereby through kind of soft power and hard power, it actually made it easier for the regime to pick and choose from a class of people who might or might not be loyal at any given moment. But the question of sort of, well, why are you not on the list? And the ability to say, if you're on the list, then it actually puts you in a more trusted kind of category. I guess the question is, do you have a policy recommendation for dealing with the inside game of, targeting these oligarchs, causing them pain, but then also not targeting some people and maybe actually disadvantaging the people who in the long term we would want to see flourishing in Russia?
No, that's thank you, Matt. That is an excellent question, and something that I think we only have a limited, at least, data a picture into. But you're exactly right. In a more full academic version of this study, we trace out the game theoretic bargaining that is occurring between the elite and the firm as to how much of a bailout they get to receive. And you can think of of this choice by the elite as to how close it decides to sit to the regime. On the one hand, the closer it sits to the regime, the more it is likely to receive shielding. On the other hand, it also may be more likely to get sanctioned in the first place. And yes, the regime, by dint of being able to choose effectively which elites get shielded and which don't, has a powerful consolidation incentive. And I think we've seen some of that anecdotally. So in terms of a policy recommendation, I would suggest that, again, going into the mind of the elite that has to decide, do I sit close or do I not sit close? There may be a case to be made for not just penalizing elites very strongly if they do sit close to the regime and therefore get sanctioned, but then get bailed out, but also the positive incentive of the relative benefits you would get if you choose not to sit with the regime and instead decide to run the risk of not getting shielded. I think that ties into a broader, discussion among economists, which is that, again, if the whole point of sanctions in the first place is to try and change behavior ultimately, and of course there's I think a debate over what exactly are these sanctions for. But if you subscribe to the view that these sanctions are meant to incentivize a change in behavior, then it's not just about penalization if they do a undesirable action. It's also about rewarding or relative rewarding if they do an action that is desirable, right? And therefore, this is stepping a little bit outside of Russia for a moment, although I think it's also applicable in the Russia case. The example of Iran and the sanctions lifting on Iran, whether you agree with the policy or not, the the supposed commercial benefits from having sanctions be lifting didn't really materialize, given the high uncertainties and so forth, the de-risking effect by the private sector. So I think to make these sanctions even more fine-tuned and surgical an instrument, and to make them more powerful as indeed a way of changing incentives, we cannot focus just upon the punitive impact upon their imposition, but also think about the hypothetical positive impact that would occur upon lifting of those sanctions.
Nigel, I want to invite you to comment on all of that, but let me tack something on that's maybe a specific case study to your kind of rubric of courses open to oligarchs. So we have the case of Mr. Deripaska, and there is a lively debate about how much influence Mr. Deripaska actually has, how close he is to Mr. Putin, how you measure those things in the first place. Is it, shaky cell phone videos taken by sex coaches, or is it by the number of meetings he has in the Kremlin, or is it by something else? In any case, I'm cognizant of your point 4, which is, can an oligarch use the resources at his or her disposal to mount some sort of influence effort? But it seems to me maybe there's a fifth alternative that has some desirability as a policy outcome, albeit not directly linked to any of the triggers for sanctions, and that would be the negotiated sort of Deripaska exit strategy that we just saw vis-a-vis U.S. sanctions, which is actually, if there is a way that sanctions might be used now to begin gradually to de-oligarchize, that's completely not a word, de-oligarchify the Russian economy, maybe that's actually a desirable policy outcome for us, and maybe that's a fifth choice on the list that gets the oligarchs sort of more of what they want with relatively less domestic political risk. But I leave that question to you, the Deripaska case, and whatever else you may want to comment on.
Okay, I'll try to come on to that. There's a lot to say about Deripaska in that case, of course. I'll try to be brief. But first, to the substance of your earlier questions and to Daniel's remarks, indeed his excellent presentation and the excellent paper on which it's based, which I commend to everyone there. So, the argument here is that the state can, through shielding, can provide some compensation to at least some key wealth holders and state companies, or perhaps private companies as well, that have been adversely affected by sanctions. So in terms of the choices that I set out for oligarchs, and the first of those was get as close to the Kremlin as possible, get closer, seek protection from sanctions. This sort of shielding option would be a way for the Kremlin to make that more appealing. I think the question, well, 2 points here. Firstly, there's no free lunch, as Daniel said. Those resources to compensate the adversely affected have to come from somewhere. And implicitly, what will happen is that a small number of big people will be protected or rewarded at the expense of the welfare of a big number of small people. So you'll get an increasingly distorted and unequal political economy in Russia, even, which will impose its own strains, and you'll get the Navalny's making videos pointing this out and so on. So it's not costless, and it's maybe not a solution. It's a kind of a patchwork. The second point I'd make is that I'm not sure that even in the best case, the Russian authorities have the resources to offer a blank check, and there'll be some who are favored and some who are not. And I, at least, just following the stream of news, even in the past 6 months or so, I'm struck by the sort of the moments of tension and friction that have arisen, the activism and even the anxiety of some of the big business lobbying there. The fact, for example, that the Belousov proposals, this came from the presidential administration, not just the government, but the presidential administration, openly derided by Lysin, the wealthiest oligarch of them all. It doesn't happen very often that a presidential administration proposal is sort of roundly criticized by a major oligarchic figure like that. I find that interesting. We've seen further demands made of the the oligarchs to invest another, I think, $120 billion or so in the economy. They're not happy about that. So I think there are distinctions to be made between the favored and the less than favored. And it's not the case that everyone who might wish to will enjoy the shield of protection that the Kremlin might wish to offer them. Just on Deripaska, incidentally, I saw a news item literally yesterday that Russia plans to double its use of aluminium over the next decade, to build things from aluminium that have not been built in Russia from aluminium for decades, and the obvious beneficiary of that is someone who owns a major aluminium, or used to own, or may sort of still does own a major aluminium company. So that
raises questions about the deal he just struck.
Indeed, that's right. A lot of very light bridges, I suppose, because aluminium is a very light metal. On the other sort of line of inquiry about lists and so on, the Belarusian case, which we're both familiar with, is a very interesting one. And yes, there was a sense in Belarus it was a sort of znak kачества to be on the list. I suppose my first thought about the comparison is to be struck by some of the differences and contrasts as well. In the case of the state officials in Belarus, what they lost was really the ability to travel to the West and hold bank accounts there, which not many of them really planned to do. It was some would like to go to Lithuania, for example, but maybe further afield. But it wasn't a great cost. I'd argue about the oligarchs, and not only the oligarchs. This is a point I didn't make, but worth stressing. Access to Western systems is much more fundamental to that. I talked about the private wealth holders, but there are people who are very close to Putin, who, and possibly even Putin himself. We don't know for sure, but there's a lot of speculation about this, and Anders Östlund is about to bring out a book about this. These people themselves, at the very, very heart of power, have major holdings of wealth overseas in jurisdictions where they keep this safe. So it's access to what some describe as oligarch valet services are pretty fundamental to the whole construction of Russia's political economy. No one really wants to keep vast amounts of wealth within Russia. To that extent, they're all sort of dependent on the rule of law, or outsourcing the rule of law overseas. I find that very, very interesting. So the costs of depriving them of that are potentially enormous, very, very large indeed. And just on, so part of the point of your question about making distinctions among oligarchs, and Dan, you made that point as well. Should we make distinctions about those who are close? It's not
regime consolidation.
Yes,
probably.
yeah. Two important and very different things happened in Western sanctioning last year with respect to the oligarchs. In January, we had the list, essentially the reproduction of the Forbes list, which was very indiscriminate, if you like. In April, April the 6th, the financial sanctions imposed, very, very specific, and the two most targeted, Deripaska and Vekselberg. The point about those sanctions, of course, was that their demonstration effect went far beyond those initial cases. So everyone, having been on the Forbes list, everyone sort of knows that they could be in the crosshairs next. So what's happened is, although the concrete actions that have been, severe actions, financial measures that have been taken on particular oligarchs are very significant to those individuals, their rippling effect, their broader implications are much greater. So those are, I haven't answered this question, but I think it's helpful to make these distinctions.
Well, wonderful. Thank you both. We've got plenty of time now for questions, so I would simply ask, raise your hand, keep it up. I will recognize you, and then one of my colleagues on either side of the room will give you a mic, and if you could just identify yourself and your institutional affiliation, if you have one, and a question with a question mark is always desirable. All right, right here, the lady in the gray sweater, yes. Just wait for the microphone. Just went over it. Thank
Sally
you.
Stoker, retired Russophile. I call myself. I was at American University in the RAND Corporation during my career. I'm asking a very basic question. I wonder if you could define elite or oligarch and give us some sense of the percentage of oligarchs, elites in the Russian Federation, so we can get some sense of the size and scope, and not only in the capitals, but also throughout the republics. It'd be great to have some of that data.
Great, thanks. Sally, you can hand your microphone to Michael in front of you, right there. Yeah, just hold off. We'll take that question first. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, excellent question. It's good to define things in a scholarly sense. So, two terms there, elites and oligarchs. Elites are typically defined as those individuals and networks individuals who enjoy access to disproportionate valued resources, which enable them to have a disproportionate influence on, typically on the governance of the state. Discussions of elites go back to the early 20th century to Italian social theorists. In the United States, C. Wright Mills, after the Second World War, spoke about this. I won't go into detail about that line of argumentation, but elites always mean privilege and the ability to protect interests in some important way. So the key question in Russia today, are these major wealth holders actually elites properly so-called? If they are very wealthy, yet they cannot do anything more with that wealth except spend it and keep it safe, if they cannot convert it into the modes of influence by which they can protect their interests, then they're not really elites. They're a kind of service nobility in a more traditional, perhaps Russian subordinate sense. Great. So there's a key question there. Oligarchs, even more, of course, the term in the 1990s, are economic elites which actually govern, in effect, formally or informally. And remember, they penetrated institutions. They owned independent media outlets. They funded political parties. They had great influence in the Duma. They even occupied formal positions. For example, Berezovsky was deputy secretary of the Security Council, and so on. And again, to go further, if we argue now that the decline of their influence in the early 2000s really was forever, then they are no longer oligarchs, properly so-called. But again, look at this in broader comparative perspective. If we do want to make the argument that those who are very wealthy are in fact not influential, then Russia is an outlier. It's an exception across time and space. It's very, very unusual to be wealthy but powerless. Very unusual for those who are groups that are very wealthy to have their core interests systematically overridden or ignored by power. And I think, to me, one of the many insights into Daniel's argument is that the fact of compensation implies actually they're not powerless. If they need to be compensated, they can't be ignored. So there's something interesting there. I go further and say, go back to 2012 and Putin's calls when he returned to the presidency and took a darker view of Russia's engagement, even then with the global economy. He started to call for de-offshorization. He said, bring this money back. He's been saying this last year. I told you so. You're not welcome to bring it back. And what happened then, and also now, he's been quietly ignored. That tells us two things. Firstly, that keeping that money overseas, and actually sending more of it overseas in the past year, is a core interest worth defying VVP over. And secondly, of course, it tells us there are limits to the ability of the Kremlin to get these people to do what the Kremlin wants.
Yeah, let me just quickly add a couple of things to there. But even as I was listening to Nigel, thinking about sort of historical parallels to the defeat of the boyars and the ghost of I think Tsar Paul the First, I believe, the father of Alexander the First, who this cloud of hanging over every czar that there might be a noble revolt, effectively. But yes, it's certainly right now, and again, this bargaining between the elite noble versus the regime, where the outside option of the noble is complete confiscation of all your wealth, counting trees in Siberia, the bargaining is clearly on one side over the other. Just to your question, ma'am, on sort of the number, obviously there's no precise number, but I just wanted to provide some numbers that may give be suggestive. So unfortunately the color is kind of faded here, but when we looked through all of the sanctioned individuals as sanctioned by the U.S. or the EU, you can see the bubble here is the U.S. sanctioned individuals on the left, and the EU being the bubble on the right being the EU sanctioned individuals. What we did is we had to divide them into two categories. The Northern Hemisphere being what we call the political figures, but basically by that we meant those individuals that did not seem to have any significant economic relationship with any firm in our database. And those in the Southern Hemisphere, which do have a significant economic relationship. And by that, we meant either being a significant shareholder or a corporate officer or a member of the board and so on. So you can see that of the fairly large number of individuals that have been sanctioned by both the U.S. and the EU, a fairly small fraction of them are actually have business interests, as far as we can tell in our corporate intelligence data. But in turn, those few individuals, say in the U.S., these 24 individuals, are linked to 242 firms. So these are firms, these are individuals that have quite a vast network of business interests. So I hope that is at least somewhat suggestive as to some numbers.
Great. So Michael, you have the microphone, and don't worry, we have plenty of time.
Yes. Michael Waller, I'm a member of the Wilson Center National Cabinet. I would be interested in having you comment on how you look at the sanctions battlefield versus how you might look at the cyber battlefield, for example. In the cyber area, we, the United States, are a bit more cautious in exercising offensive cyber weapons for fear of how retaliation might come back to us. In the sanctions area, do you believe that this is an area where the U.S. or U.S.-led coalitions can act with more impunity and without any concern for any sort of retaliatory actions on the same battlefield or an adjacent battlefield? Question mark.
Great question. Who wants to tackle that?
Maybe you want to start? Okay. Yeah, excellent question. So I mentioned that 2018 was a significant sanctions year because private elites were targeted. It was significant for a couple of other reasons as well. I think one is that it became absolutely clear that sanctions are now a long-term condition of the Russian-Western relationship and not something that's likely to go away, and there aren't obvious specific things that Russia could do, even if it were so minded to do them, that would lift them. And I think there's a strong understanding in Russia of that now. The second reason is that Russia has stopped trying to retaliate in kind. It did so earlier with the self-sanctioning, of course. There was discussion and there were angry proposals in the Duma to try to respond to the latest sanctions imposed last year. And some of the major companies actually said, no, you mustn't do this. It would be very dangerous. You mustn't stop our titanium exports, for example. That would hurt us very much. That brings home to me the asymmetry in strength here. Russia may try to find other ways to retaliate, but not in kind. And I think one of the larger lessons of these sanctions is that they demonstrate the formidable power that America wields globally through its ability to impose financial sanctions, including secondary sanctions on others. It's really extraordinary, to the extent that even China now and Chinese companies have been deterred from completing some transactions, from yuan ruble transactions, for example, as a consequence of the potential secondary effects. A Chinese military company, remember, this was actually subject to American sanctions. So rather than driving the two countries together, we sometimes see some of that narrative. I would argue that economic sanctions are at least constraining economic cooperation between the two. One more point about the very interesting comparison between cyber and and economic sanctions. So we've seen, of course, a great deal of cyber disruption of Western politics and Western electoral processes. It's sometimes argued that the 21st century, the fates of nations, will be influenced not so much by relative power, but relative resilience. And perhaps the source of unresilience, the source of vulnerability in the past 2 or 3 years, has been Western mass politics. One might argue the source of unresilience, the source of vulnerability in Russia, might be elite politics. I just offer that as a sort of counterpoint speculation.
Yeah, no, excellent question and an excellent answer. I think just a quick further thoughts. Obviously, the story of cyber warfare is still early. I actually just unofficially advise a startup company that is trying to support insurance companies in pricing cybersecurity risk. The challenge is that there's no data. Well, I mean, little data, right? With the standard insurance against hurricanes or something, you have centuries even worth of hurricane data to start understanding these probabilities, and even then it's complicated as climate change and other environmental factors may affect those probabilities. With cybersecurity, the incidences are relatively few. There's very few comprehensive data, and so even telling the difference between say a plain vanilla denial of service attack versus a more a serious data breach, where do the boundaries end between cyber espionage versus an actual act of cyber warfare? Again, I would say it's very gray. But I will say one lesson that I've learned from thinking about economic sanctions is that the whole heart of why these sanctions work as well as they do is because of the near monopoly control that Western companies have in providing high-quality financial services, as Nigel mentioned earlier. In my paper, I go and show how statistically that actually matters for these things. Similarly, Western companies have maybe, depending on how you count, I suppose, a similarly, or a strong commanding position in technologies, but yet, while in some way we have the United States and others have learned how to weaponize that monopoly control over financial services, we have not yet, I think, and I'm not saying we should necessarily, figure out a way to use that as an instrument of state power. But I would say that the ground may be similarly promising.
Yeah. If for what it's worth, if I may add, my tagline on this is always the best revenge is living well. So really, current sanctions targets, Russia obviously being unprecedentedly the largest, but then, should we say, fellow travelers, other large economies that might consider themselves in the future to potentially be subject to some type of pressure based on the monopoly on these services, the single most effective response they could begin to develop now would be their own capabilities to provide these services in very attractive and accessible ways. And I actually think we're beginning to see a movement in that direction because, they're not stupid market actors.
I think that's exactly right. And I think this ties into an even broader debate that is intensively discussed among economists as to, the shorthand for it being the long-term resiliency of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency of choice. And I would just throw a shout out to Professor Barry Eichengreen's recent book, where he paints a not altogether optimistic picture on the future of the U.S. dollar. So.
Great. Yuval here. Microphone.
Thank you. Yuval Weber from Daniel Morgan Graduate School, and also here of the Wilson Center. Let me ask sort of a question for both of you, because it's bringing together both of your presentations. It seems that, in effect, the causes of sanctions that we're talking about annexation of Crimea, support for war in Ukraine, Syria, electoral manipulation, and so forth, they collectively define what is Russia's foreign policy and attempts to revise the international order. So the sanctions themselves, obviously, they haven't changed much of Russian behavior, because if they could, that would probably be the end of Vladimir Putin's time in office. He would be out of a job more or less that day. And we've seen that, from your presentation, Daniel, that in effect, Russia is too big to sanction because it's a big place without going to extreme efforts such as a SWIFT ban. And that the interesting part of what you said is that compensating the insiders is really only costing about $13 billion, which seems to be an affordable cost. Now, it seems that if sanctions don't change Russia's foreign policy behavior, really one of the subtext of both Nigel and your presentations was that this is meant to effectively induce elite defection by showing that there is a positive incentive. If one gets rid of either Putin or the policies, relaxation of sanctions will bring in a lot more money. So if Putin is only spending $13 billion in order, basically as an insurance policy against elite defection, is that not a sustainable policy? So how does one induce elite defection if it's only $13 billion?
Who wants to tackle that?
Well, I'll just first quickly say that the 13 billion is a conservative estimate as to what the cost is. It's the cost that we calculated by accumulating all of that lost revenue, hypothetical lost revenue that does not appear in the data, and then imputed that has to have come from outside sources. But actually, as as my anecdotal example suggests, compensating Bank Russia by giving it a wholesale electricity contract may be an otherwise source of government revenue that they could have gathered from somewhere else, but there's a general welfare cost associated with providing, granting the monopoly to an otherwise substandard provider. Actually, the news suggests that the previous bank that actually used to be doing all of this wholesale electricity servicing had to be hired as a contractor to actually do all of the work. And the people who suffer for this, of course, are the Russian people who suffer from poor electricity services. Also add that once you get sanctioned, however, and this is the other part of this chart, once you get sanctioned, then there's sort of every incentive to just sort of go along with the regime. And we also, the very next day after Bank Russia received this largesse, it announces that it will be the first bank to open commercial retail operations in the Crimea region, which the Bank Russia leadership bluntly stated does not make commercial sense, but they will do it anyway out of solidarity to the regime's foreign policy. So the elites may still be, they may get compensated, and then they may be paying it in a different way, in some way paying back the regime in kind through other services that, again, sort of support the regime. So I think the problem is in some way even stickier than one of just driving a wedge. Once the regime has more bargaining power over these elites, the elites also not only get closer to the regime, but actually start trying to actualize actions that we don't like.
This is like when Tony Soprano bails you out of your gambling debt.
Right.
You'll pay.
I'm fundamentally sympathetic to your depiction of where we are with sanctions now. The range of reasons for which they've been applied has accumulated to the extent that de facto, yes, they are sanctions on Putin's foreign policy as such. At least to the extent that it's hard to imagine any conceivable series of behavioral changes that this regime could undertake that would warrant their lifting. So we've moved from a world where it's a particular action, a particular contingent sanction applied, which might therefore be lifted if the behavior were changed, to a situation where the application of sanctions has become an instrument of choice, really, on a broadening range of behaviors. I thought the formula applied, the form of words applied last April, a pattern of malign activity around the world, captured this very well, the sheer breadth of it. So yes, no one thinks the sanctions are forever, but we sort of now have a situation like we did during the Cold War, when elements of the sanctions regime could only be lifted, were only likely to be lifted once the Cold War was over, once the fundamental adversarial relationship had changed. So again, I think there's this broad understanding in Russia now that they're here to stay as long as Russia is under present management, at least implicitly. So Bismarck said, the less you know about how laws and sausages are made at night, the better you'll sleep. And it's, in that sense, we've sort of we've seen an implicit direction of travel of sanctions policy in the West. No one has said explicitly these sanctions will only be lifted once, again, present management changes in Russia. But at least implicitly, that seems to be the sort of territory we are moving into. No one, as far as I'm aware, has said at a policy level that the purpose is to induce elite defection. I was trying to sort of draw out some of the implications, some of the ways that Russian elites might themselves be beginning to think about these things. In Russia itself, incidentally, last year in particular, we saw very explicit sort of debates and arguments and so on. People say proactively, preemptively saying, the West is trying to divide our elites, split our elites, and we won't let this happen. They weren't responding to anything, as far as I'm aware, that Western policymakers had said. There was this presupposition that that's what we were trying to do, which I think is quite interesting. Now, on your pricing of the sanctions cost, so to speak, I think I'd take a slightly different view. Firstly, the total cost of sanctions go far beyond the $13 billion. So $13 billion is absolutely right. But if one is looking at the total impact they have on Russia, I think one would have to cast the net far more widely. One reason is that that $13 billion isn't a blank check for everyone. There's clearly a good deal of quiet oligarch discontent and so on, at least concern. And again, points of growing sort of friction with power. So that $13 billion, if we're going to look at that figure, may not be enough. Can't assume it works. Secondly, the effects of sanctions, even the existing sanctions, are likely to grow. They're designed to do so. And to me, one of the most interesting comments in Russia about sanctions was Patrushev's remarks to some governors in central Russia last August, I think it was. Remarks that became public, and he said, quite candidly, these energy sanctions and technology sanctions are demonstrating the extent of our vulnerability on Western technologies, and they are imposing a severe and growing cost on the development of our energy sector. So even existing sanctions will become more severe in the range of effects that they impose, as they were designed to do. Thirdly, it's much more likely that there'll be more sanctions than less sanctions. So as we know, there are bills that have been worked up in Congress already. If even some of those measures are passed, then the annual costs of the totality of sanctions regimes will only increase. And their psychological costs, as well as their material costs as well, will increase. And finally, there's the matter of growth foregone. Again, the fundamental purpose of sanctions isn't to hurt the economy as a whole, to act as a blunt instrument, but they do have an adverse effect on growth as well, as people like Kudrin and others have made very clear. I'm sure there are other factors as well. Just a quick list. So I agree with the $13 billion as the current cost of shielding some core interests. But I think if we want to conduct an accounting exercise of the total impact, I think it'd be far greater.
You know, it often occurs to me that where we are in the technology of sanctions is so early in what's likely to be a decades-long new reality that it's sort of like conversations early in the nuclear age, where at one end of the spectrum, you know, people wanted to sort of throw these things, lob them like grenades on the battlefield, and at the other end, you know, people thought one nuke would set off nuclear winter. We sort of, a lot of this is trial and error in a sense.
And just to continue that analogy one step further, there seems to be an increasing arms race, if you will, between the sanctioning technology and the anti-sanctions shielding technology, as Russia is trying to develop more coordinating offices to properly protect parts of the economy.
So we have less than 10 minutes. I saw at least 3 or 4 hands up. With your permission, what I'll do is take a number of questions here and then let each of you kind of conclude touching on those you'd like to. So I have Will, and then as I said, keep your hands high so I can, Rachel there. I think that, yes, in the back there, I can't see. Yeah, Catherine, and then I had a couple more hands. We'll try to get to you.
I just want to follow up on Nigel's last point, and if you could kind of talk a little bit more about the impact of sanctions on economic growth and potential lost economic growth as a result of the sanctions. Putin clearly has decided to pursue a much more conservative economic policy, not big government spending, fear of inflation, high interest rates, maintaining a large rainy day fund. So what are the consequences of that? How much growth do you think has been lost as a result of these sanctions?
Great, and then Rachel here.
Hi, I had a question about the sanctions arms race situation, which is if sanctions are now becoming sort of the tool of choice for a wide range of options, and the kind of rational, target-y approach to that is beginning to become more resilient against the U.S. capacity to sanction, which is to say create its own mechanisms, create its own stronger financial systems, create its own international institutions. At what point does the U.S. reliance on sanctions actually become counterproductive for what it hopes to achieve?
Okay, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine Schuler, and I'm a Wilson Fellow and a professor at the University of Maryland. This is, I think, primarily for Daniel. Very near the end of your presentation, you mentioned soft power, and I'm curious as to what you mean by that. Whether we're talking there about cultural politics, which is the way I think of soft power. I see Russia doing that pretty well internally. I don't see much of that coming from the West. And of course, the state controls, by and large, the media. And so I'm curious as to how we're supposed to communicate to the Russian people more broadly through soft power that we're not the ones responsible for their suffering.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. I am going to have to cut it off there just in the interest of time. So we have the extent of lost growth, whether the arms race at some point hits a tipping point and becomes counterproductive, and then what do you mean by soft power? So who wants to go first?
I can take the first question on the economic impact. Again, the $13 billion was just the impact, the conservative estimate as to the cost to the regime to shield. But of course, many of these firms are not shielded as well. And the conservative estimate as to the overall macroeconomic impact of that is around 1.3% of GDP, which is not insignificant. However, it is obviously only a fraction of the, call it 6 to 7% decline in GDP since 2000, from peak to trough in 2014, mostly attributable to the drop in oil prices. The longer term question is very interesting, but much harder, because we have to think of a counterfactual world where the sanctions did not happen, and not only therefore is the immediate impact not there, but all of the more sort of pernicious impact on the Russian political economy, if you will, right? If Russian firms are being forced to do otherwise commercially unprofitable and irrational things out of, again, a sense of solidarity with the regime, that is not only just a waste of immediate resources, but it will have a corrosive effect upon their longer-term productivity. We did some studies as to specifically what this might impact in the Russian energy sector, given the lack of access to deep water and shale and so on. And that, roughly speaking, we estimated to be another 2% of GDP in the long run. So an incremental 2% slower growth in the long run. But again, I would put a small boulder-sized grain of salt to those numbers because it is a very challenging counterfactual.
Just very quick clarification. When you said 1.3% of GDP, and we assume roughly a sort of $1 trillion GDP for Russia, it's just coincidental that that's 13 billion?
Oh, I never thought about that coincidence.
It really is just
yes.
coincidence. I'm asking.
Yes, it is a
Okay.
coincidence.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Good.
Soft power.
Do you want to take the second one then?
Okay. Well, just briefly to follow up that point about there's the aggregate macroeconomic effects of sanctions, both their impact and also the second-order effects of all Russia's responses as well. And it would take some tracing actually to see where they lead. Russia's fiscal surplus, for example, a very, very conservative fiscal policy, that has deleterious impacts for growth. That's been taken as a defensive sort of resilience measure, and many other things as well, but also the distributional effects as well. Food price inflation, for example. I read some the other day, that's going to be 8% in the first quarter alone. So you're going to create further distortions and further forms of inequality as well. Again, it's as much a matter of defensive responses as the impact of the first-order impact of sanctions themselves. Just on resilience to sanctions, yes, absolutely. This is, I think, potentially something to worry about. And that's why the renewed sanctions in Iran are concerning, because here you have some of America's sanctions allies on other issues actually talking about trying to find ways to evade American sanctions on Iran. So if those methods and those innovations are being supported in the case of Iran by America's allies, then you're creating experience that can be usable by Russia as well, potentially, by China too. Juan Zarate, in his book Treasury's War, a very good book about his experience in the previous decade, innovating financial sanctions measures against al-Qaeda criminal groups and Iran and North Korea, worries at the end of that book about the overuse of sanctions, summoning effective responses. So that arms race, you'd get the defensive measures, as it were, matching the innovation in sanctions instruments. So it's a continued arms race. But if one looks in the round at what's going on in the rest of the world with Iran, I think there are heightened reasons to worry and focus on that.
Okay. And did you want to touch on soft power?
Yes, I will. But just actually a quick note to that as well. So yes, I think we need to be considering, again, the monopoly status of Western banks in providing financial services is the bedrock behind the power of these sanctions, and there is very much that danger of overusage and incentivizing an alternative structure. But I would say, therefore, not only should we consider, therefore, how costly it is impacting upon our own financial system and how much it may be, weakening the competitiveness, if you will, of our financial services. But also a way to do that is maybe not just be more judicious and conscientious about the usage of sanctions, but also on the supply side, if you will, continue to try and strive for innovation in financial services to maintain that competitive edge. Mm-hmm. And then on soft power, I actually would like to hear more from the rest of the panel. But I was thinking of, so again, this very tricky task, and I'm not a media expert, but of trying to communicate to the Russian public of of who is actually the agency and who is ultimately the one truly responsible for your pension having been raided, or your real purchasing power having been plummeted 20% due to double-digit inflation, et cetera. I think, therefore, agencies like I know it used to be the BBG, it's now the U.S. Agency for Global Communications, and their Russia language news program. I mean, again, like all of these things need to be properly complementary to the hard power of sanctions itself for truly maximum impact.
Right. Wonderful. Well, I hope you all join me in thanking our two speakers. I thought that was a phenomenal discussion.